For our final session, we're going to bring on Miranda Threlfall-Holmes, who is pretty local to here, in charge of St Luke's in the City, team rector of St Luke's in the City. And you've heard different bits from different parts of your congregation, which is great, and Sam. And we're hoping that you're going to have some kind of dialogue that kind of draws together some different themes and threads. So, Miranda and Sam, thank you.
Yeah, so we're going to attempt to try and pull together some of the themes that, as we've been listening to the whole day, have come up and do a bit of theological reflection on them. And also, because we can only do too much in half an hour, pull together some of these questions and comments that you've put on here, which we'll make sure go out on that email as well. So if we can't talk about everything, we'll make sure that those aren't lost and are kept there. There's a whole series of questions on one of these flip charts from the handwriting. I think they might all be from the same person, around this whole debate around congregations and community and online church and how we're passive and how we're congregation, how we do things conversationally. And it did seem to me that one of the real themes that kept coming up through the day was the theme of community. I know we've said a few times when we've talked about Heartedge that it's the C that isn't in the four C's. That everyone kind of, we all keep accidentally saying that community is one of the four C's and then going, oh, it's not, no, it's not, and remembering what the other ones are. And I don't know what you'd say to this, Sam, but it seemed to me that there's one of the things that the pandemic seems to have opened up, and particularly this debate between online and in person, is a real question that I don't think we've actually started answering yet about actually what community is. What are the essential ingredients of community? There's a certain element of, well, we know we can only do it properly if we're together, or maybe we can't. Other people saying, no, I do community perfectly well online, thank you very much. But actually a bit of a vacuum and possibly a space for debate. Maybe this is a future Heartedge conversation about actually what is community and how do you build it?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between the two key words in Christianity, which are communion and community. So for me, communion is about us and God. And the wonder of the word communion is that the first half of it is the Latin word for with, and the second half of it is the Latin word for one. And when we think of our relationship with God and we think about eternal life, we are somewhat divided between whether we want to be with God or whether we want to somehow be absorbed into God. And communion is the perfect combination of the two. And then when we turn to community, if that's the vertical, then community, it seems to me, is the horizontal word. It's so appropriate. It's a very similar word, but it's a word that refers to our ability to relate to one another. And as Crispin was saying on the panel, it's relationship all the way down. Christianity is about relationship, and that's obviously music to my ears, as I've spent so much of the last 10 or 12 years saying that with is the most important word in theology and in the church. What I think we've discovered in the last 18 months is, I think, two complementary things. One is there are a number of different ways to be community, and online is a valid way to be community. And the second thing is that for some people, not just in COVID, but permanently, and I'm thinking particularly of people on the autistic spectrum who've said this to me on many occasions in the last 18 months, it's actually preferable to good old-fashioned church. So it seems to me we now simply, as we come out of COVID and hopefully it becomes a thing of the past, it has left us with a legacy of more diverse ways to create community. And community, I would define as patterns of mutual interdependence, where we realize there are some things that I can help you with, and there are some things that you can help me with. And when you draw some sort of cat's cradle of that across a whole number of people, then you have something called community. And so we will look back, I think, and I think Moira said this on the panel this morning, we will look back in 30 years' time on this period as the time when we found, or it was thrust upon us, significant new ways to be community.
One of the things that I was reflecting on quite early on in the pandemic, when there was all the outcry about people not being in churches, was that actually as a church we should be able to talk about being community and being in communion without being bodily present, because actually that's kind of what we're in the business. We talk about the communion of saints a lot. The early church did it all the time. All those times where Paul spent a week or a few months with some people and then just sent the odd letter. But clearly still considered himself to be in community with them. Actually, that there's a long history in Christianity of us doing community without being bodily present to each other, which we seem to have rather ignored.
Yes, and what you find in times of adversity is you have to improvise and you have to fall back on your tradition, which is why I gave those 6 dates as parts of our history that I think we ought to keep in mind, because they are a resource bank, they are a larder of things we can turn to. If I were critical of some aspects of the reaction to the pandemic, and I don't want to be very critical because it was pretty rubbish time for everybody. That in the lament was lament for some things that I don't think have to be central to our tradition. And as you've just pointed out, the early Christians did not go to church.
Yeah.
The Acts of the Apostles, there is no church building that appears in the Acts of the Apostles. Sorry, sunshine. So, there are some things there that it's worth bearing in mind.
Absolutely. There's a question here about lament, actually. Somebody asking what place lament has in our church worship and conversations in the next few months. And that I think, has been quite an interesting debate. Not necessarily in congregations, but in the kind of, vicar-type conversations that have gone on over the last few months. There's been a lot of discussion about how we'll need to open up space for lament. And I don't know about you, but I'm not finding there's actually very much appetite in congregations to lament.
I think All Souls, for those for whom All Souls is a significant day in the church's year, and I think then the next Ash Wednesday would offer 2 significant days in your average church congregation's year, where I think we can take that up. What we're going to face at All Souls this year is, I think last year it fell into that November sort of 3rd degree lockdown, or whatever we called it at the time. So I think this year we've got an opportunity and a challenge, which is, do we highlight the deaths from COVID amongst the deaths that we're remembering at All Souls, or do we, which is sort of kind of strange that some deaths are more special, and that's kind of a bit weird. However, there's something poignant about it. And they must have faced the same issues during the 2 world wars.
Yeah.
People had died in the war, but people had died of being run over by a tractor, which is the more tragic. But that we do have those moments in our year, I think, when we can, which are occasions for corporate grief, penitence, and lament. And I think we should certainly make the most of them. And I think the point about lament is, you're allowed to swear when you're lamenting. I mean, the lament has got to come from the gut. It's really got to be, it's unprocessed food. It just comes out any old shape and form, and you just put it out there and say to God, here is the kingdom of God that we thought we were pursuing. Here is our current reality, and there is this massive gap between the two. Deal with it. I can't deal with it. And that's what lament is. And I think there's a place for that, frankly, in many acts of worship. After an earthquake or something, what on earth do we say or do? And I think I would say All Souls should be a time. If I were Archbishop, I would decree. I'm not sure decreeing is the sort of thing that Archbishops should do, actually. But,
Decree that while the pandemic's still on, everyone should come back to church as a massive, great group of people.
No, that's the Miranda approach. I can see that. I think it's a better job for you than for me. But I think All Souls is an opportunity for us to sort of, in a sense, pile all of that onto one existing occasion.
But I also wonder whether there's a case for looking at dates that aren't our church dates. I think this might be part of what we're beginning to learn, that actually we need to have conversations with dates and opportunities that are coming from wider society rather than necessarily trying to fit people's mourning and feelings into our own dates. Just thinking back to Jen's presentation about Open Table earlier, one of the things I found most interesting and most moving about Open Table running at St Bride's is the way its calendar is shaped partly by the church calendar, but actually primarily by the LGBT calendar. So November isn't All Souls. November is Transgender Day of Remembrance. And December, actually isn't really Advent, it's World AIDS Day. And actually it's quite moving to have, actually there are these really important festivals, if I can use that word, days of remembrance, dates where we're remembering things which aren't run by our agenda, but that we then are prepared to be in dialogue with.
Well, the one at St Martin's has been the day we remember those who died homeless in London, which tends to be a figure in the sort of 100 and somethings each year. And pretty much all the homeless support workers in London come to that service. It goes on far too long. It's actually quite boring, but people love it and they come. And if you talk to staff at the Connection at our homeless centre, in relation to the church, that when I came, and this is absolutely none of my doing, I'm not involved with the planning of the service at all, it wasn't particularly well attended, and something changed about 5 or 6 years ago, and now pretty much everybody, all the staff, all the friends of the Connection, all the staff of the Passage, all the staff of the West London Mission, they all come. And we get an interactive thing for them to come forward and do. It's just it's a sort of quasi-sacramental gesture. And they take away a card with somebody's name on it, and they can put it on their mantelpiece. We don't say pray for it every day, but that's what we kind of hope they'll do. So again, it's a kind of, in a sense, it's a community liturgy. But it does give me a chance to say, while we're here, I did mention this morning the first principle of Heartedge, and we have two founding principles, and the first one, as you'll remember, I'm sure, and will have memorized, is that God is giving us everything we need, but we tend to experience our life as scarcity because we tend to turn away most of the gifts God sends us. But the second principle of Heartedge is that if you look back in the history of faith, our times of adversity have been the times of both innovation and deeper understanding, and that focuses particularly on Israel's experience of the exile, where they came closer to God in exile than they'd ever been in the Promised Land, paradoxically, and obviously refers to the early disciples' experience of the crucifixion, where they found the same, this was the great disaster, but they felt closer to God in Christ crucified than at any other time before or since. And then that's been our experience, that's our experience now, that it's in times of adversity, paradoxically, that the distance between us and God is made much thinner, and that Heartedge is, it's deliberately not aiming to be the laminated church, if you like. And I think Joe and Dave certainly stressed this in their presentations, that this is not somebody with all the answers saying, go and do it in one of these 5 ways and come back and tell us how wonderful you are and how much like us you've become. It's absolutely not that. It's recognizing that each of us in different ways, as we reflect on times of adversity, find the truth about God.
I mean, you've touched really there, particularly in that lovely phrase, community liturgy, on one of the other big themes that it seemed to me comes out of the day, which is obvious really, which is about partnership working. And just as we're thinking about reflection and the theology of that, it seemed to me that as we were beginning to think about, we've talked a lot about consultation with local needs, Kath talking about finding out what the local community wants, looking at the demographics, looking at potential partners, praying, asking what God's calling us to do. And it seemed to me that actually there's a huge amount in our tradition about wisdom and discernment. And actually when we talk about partnership working, really the theology that we can bring to bear on that is the theology of discernment, and how do we discern what's of God and what our vocation is, individually but also corporately.
Well, I tend to be a bit unsophisticated when it comes to this, which is to say, where is the energy in your community? You know, partnership working, I grew up in Somerset with the Wurzels, I don't know if you remember them, but they more or less summarised partnership working with the unforgettable phrase, I've got 20 acres and you got 43, but I got a brand new combine harvester and I'll give you the key. So I think there was a little bit of double entendre there, but you know, I was only young in the 70s, so of course that just went straight past me. But I remember the point about partnership working. And so, you know, to me, it's about energy. And I was just sharing with a couple of new friends over coffee just now that the hardest thing in ministry is creating energy. What you're doing when you go into a new parish as a priest, or when you just become church warden, as one person shared earlier, you're saying, where is the energy in this community? And that's kind of a synonym for saying, what is the Holy Spirit doing in this community? And, you know, Jen shared about the open table. You know, Jen had, well, I mean, I'm speaking for you. We haven't even had a chance to talk together over coffee today. But what I'm assuming, what you were saying in your wonderful presentation was, you know, I had a lot of energy around my own emerging sexuality, and I had a lot of energy around my Christian faith, which was also emerging. You know, the magic happened when those two interacted, and I realized that they could be complementary to each other and not in tension with, in destructive tension with one another. And suddenly, Jen has untold amounts of energy to be leading these wonderful communities, as she told us earlier. And it's my conviction, and it's based on 30 years in ministry, that we're all Jen in some way. We've all got things suppressed inside ourselves that we don't think anyone else wants to know about, or if they did, they would be either unimpressed or horrified. And we've all got experience and potential of interaction with communities, and the skill in ministry is to find those energies and then to put them together and let the Holy Spirit do the rest. I mean, that's
which all sounds lovely.
It does sound lovely.
It
has been lovely. I've had nothing but a great time the last 30 years. It's been fantastic.
It is lovely. However, what do we then do when something that we know we should be doing that's important, actually no one seems to have the energy for? There's a question here about climate change. If climate change is top of the agenda, it's a quote from earlier, why is every single light on in the church? With a clarification, saying that's not just a flippant question. It's a reset button. We've got the opportunity to ask why we do things. But I mean, it was interesting. You know, we heard from Annie earlier, who's working on a project with one of my churches, the Roots in the City project. Huge amounts of energy there for working towards net zero and so on. And yet that church has only got a Bronze Eco Award, and the other churches haven't really even started the process apart from going on and registering. Because every time it's mentioned, everyone goes, oh yeah, we really ought to do that, oughtn't we? And you can feel the energy drop. So we get that difficulty, don't we, between the things that we kind of know are important and we ought to do, and yet that wonderful desire to follow where the energy is.
Yeah, and that means we're constantly in a situation of change and emerging possibilities. And this is one of the difficult things, you know, everybody here will know this about churches. My guess is, if I were to say a phrase like, being a Christian is to believe the future's bigger than the past, I would guess pretty much everyone here today would sign up to that. However, we're all part of churches where a large amount of the energy is devoted to trying getting us back to the past. That's what church is for a lot of people. The past when my mum was still alive and she used to come here. You know, that kind of past. That past when I used to run the young mothers group and my kids were small, and now they haven't turned out quite as I hoped they would do. So let's go back to that time when my kids were small and the life was. Do you see what I mean? That's what church can be for a lot of people. And so how we use that energy is, we have to listen to the pain that's actually behind that. We can't dismiss it and say, you know, get with the program. There's pain behind that. My kids didn't turn out as I hoped. But I've still got energy for kids, and they haven't had grandkids. I don't have the grandkids, you know. So, but how can we use that energy? You've obviously still got a calling to work, to be with children. How can we? Do you see what I mean? So So you're always trying to see what's the pain behind that clinging on, behind that sigh that says, oh, the climate, oh, I guess we better do so, that kind of thing. And you're constantly sort of weaving around. So to give an example from my own experience, I certainly don't want to say my own experience is normative, but we had a big quarrel. You know how communities can have a quarrel that you walk in there as a newcomer and you think, this quarrel's been going on for about 20 years. And actually both sides are very clear in where they stand with that quarrel. Anyway, so one happy story of getting through a quarrel like that at St. Martin's was we'd had a pattern of lunchtime concerts since about 1380. It went back into the mists of time, at least 3 a week. And the clergy felt the church actually ought to be used for worship occasionally. And we had this Thursday lunchtime Lectio service. Now, people may be familiar with Lectio Divina. You get in a small group, you read a passage, you contemplate it, read a passage, people say out loud words that were significant to that sort of passage, which is great in a small group. It's absolutely useless in a big church like this with about 15 people and a dog in it. And frankly, you can get 15 people and a dog to anything at St. Martin's because it's in Trafalgar Square, or at least you used to before we all stayed at home for 18 months at a time. So there was this face-off between the clergy absolutely forcing through an agenda. We have to have this service that clearly isn't working and never has. And we got the concerts department saying, well, we might as well use it because you lot are useless. Nobody wants to worship God on a Thursday lunchtime. So what did we do? In the end, what we did was we said, let's have something that looks like a concert and looks a bit like a worship service at the same time, and is a sort of hybrid of the two. We won't pray, we won't wear vestments, we won't light the candles, but we will have some talk from the clergy about the background of the music and the religious context in which it was written and the theology behind it, the historical circumstances, and we will sing a couple of hymns, but we'll sing them sitting down, so it doesn't feel like worship. But on the way out, some people say that was a lovely service, Vicar. Maybe because people see a collar and they say lovely service, Vicar, as a kind of Pavlovian reaction. I don't know. So some people feel it was a service and other people say that was a great concert. And you think, well, it wasn't quite a concert. Doesn't matter what they say. Anyway, pre-lockdown, we were getting 300 or so people coming most Thursdays to this. And that was about the energy and getting out of those stuck places and trying to improvise and listen to what everybody really wanted. And they ended up all being happy with what they got.
Yeah, when you were talking about energy earlier, I was thinking of that the scientific phrase, energy can't be created or destroyed. We can't manufacture energy, but we probably can find where it is and perhaps redirect it, channel it.
Yes. So, another example, again, a colleague of mine, something I had nothing to do with myself, but during lockdown, she keyed in, and some of it was due to her own personal life narrative, to the fact that during the first 6 to 9 months of the pandemic, a lot of people were getting in touch not just with their own mortality, but with their own experience of bereavement, and ran an online bereavement group. So you might say, where's the energy? The energy's into bereavement. Yay, lots of energy for bereavement. Bereavement, anybody? Come here. We're doing bereavement here. It's great. We're loving it. But so energy is obviously not, is to be understood in a broad sense. Actually, there was a lot of energy for bereavement, and it did bring out people's previous experiences of bereavement, and people shared very deeply. And there are still people who would say, if you said over the last 18 months what was the most significant thing that happened at St. Martin's, they would say joining that online bereavement group. And again, once you've been listened to, then you can listen to other people's experience, and then you can actually be in ministry, which is helping other people face the hardest things in their lives. So I'd say that was a kind of paradoxical example of going where the energy is.
Yeah.
But that's a great point about energy can't, what was that again? Energy can't
be created nor destroyed.
Created or destroyed. That's going behind an ear.
I can't remember who it is. It might be Einstein.
Einstein.
Newton?
Like both of them said some quite
scientist.
interesting things in there. Yeah.
Someone says on one of these, could we stop talking of social justice and focus on generosity more?
That is a very countercultural thing to say.
It's a very countercultural thing to say. And when I read that, I found myself thinking of the the phrase in the Bible of justice and mercy meeting and kissing. And that actually, mercy is not generosity, I know, but that was the phrase that came to mind, that there is something about grace being more than simple justice, and yet it's not less than justice, it's justice plus rather than justice minus.
Yes, mercy isn't the withholding or the abolition of judgment. It is not using your ability to judge to destroy the person who is then found guilty. You can't have mercy without justice. But the thing about this point, I'll just read it again because we can see it and you can't. Could we stop talking of social justice and focus on generosity more? I think where I'd slightly nuance that, if it were me, would be to say justice is a kind of love. It's not all of love, but you can't have love without it. And the place I would go to epitomize that, I think, would be Isaiah 43. And I think the first 9 verses or so of Isaiah 43 would be the text I would take to my desert island, I think, because I think you can never stop reading that. I can never stop reading those verses. And they're arranged as a chiasmus, that's to say the first verse and the 9th verse correspond, and the second verse and the 8th verse, anyway, all the way in. So they're kind of like an arrow. And then the middle one, the 5th verse, is the crucial one, where God says to Israel, you are precious, honoured, and loved. And the reason I mention that in this context is because there may be people here, I'm sure there are people here, who know what it feels like to be loved but not honoured, who know what it feels like to be precious but not really loved. Each of those 3 words, it seems to me, they're like a prism. You've got to turn them round, and you need all 3. And plenty of people have had painful experiences of not having all 3 and but I love you, therefore I can do terrible things to you and you're not allowed to complain because I love you. That's not being precious, and that's not being honoured. It seems to me so. We use the phrase social justice because love seems a bit soft. But once we add in some of the scriptural, hinterland of love, precious, honoured, and loved, every person in this country has every reason to expect to be precious, honoured, and loved, it seems to me. And when I talked about Augustine earlier and talked about how right worship leads to justice, then Christians have got something important to say about justice if they talk about the language of being precious, honoured, and loved. And I had the wonderful opportunity. It was the first posh dinner I've been invited to since the last 18 months, and occasionally I get an invite as Vicar of St Martin's for a posh dinner. This was at the Old Bailey. Fascinating evening, but the real sting was in the tail. When we went round, we saw the number 1 court at the Old Bailey, most famous court in the country, probably. But at the very end, and it was clear that the High Sheriff who'd invited us knew exactly what he was doing. He took us down to the cells where people are held before they come upstairs to be tried, and they are absolutely horrifying. We can't call it justice if we keep people in those kinds of conditions. I just think there is nothing precious, honoured, or loved about our prisons and the way we treat people who haven't even yet been convicted of anything in this country. And I would go back to the words precious, honour. What part of that? And because there's no preciousness, there's no honour in that, and there's no love in that, we can't call that justice.
That's interesting, because I was thinking of Isaiah as well. And where Isaiah talks about setting a foundation stone, it's always talked about as a Christological prediction. But what he says is, there's going to be this foundation stone of justice and righteousness. And the more I think about this, I think actually the difference between talking about justice and talking about generosity is that justice is something that everyone deserves as a right. Justice is about, you've got this regardless of whether I want to give it to you or not. Generosity almost goes back to what you've talked about in some of your books and in some of the original stuff you were talking about with Heartedge, about that kind of, the benefactor or steward model. Generosity is about me having something which I can choose generously to give you. And it's more about my generosity or God's generosity or whoever's generosity you're talking about than about my right. So I'm not, actually, the more I think
It does
about
assume a level of power. There's no question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So perhaps it depends whether we're talking about this in relation to God or in relation to individuals.
Well, the other thing about that, I would say, is, and this is, you'd think I would turned into a firebrand evangelical preacher, which maybe would be a good thing. I don't know. It's probably not very likely to happen.
All things are possible.
But all things are possible. However, in that mode, the point needs to be made that our salvation is not just.
Yeah.
It is an act of mercy and not of justice. I'm not going to go into substitution theories, which I don't subscribe to, but if we were added up, if I was added up, I would be found wanting, and we are not punished eternally for and therefore, it's in some ways we're the beneficiaries of the fact that justice is not the only virtue.
Absolutely. And if power is implied in generosity, then there is something to be said. Well, I think it is. I think there is something, because if you've got the power to be generous, you have that. But then actually there is something to be said for being attentive to issues of power rather than pretending they're not there.
I think that touches on something, and I think, in some ways it came up in the interjection about race, and reflections on the church today. One thing, an organisation like Heartedge, leaders of churches like people here today, need to work hard to model is the good exercise of power. I think I grew up in an era, which is on the back end of the 60s, where we thought power was just a bad thing, and it was always a thing that other people had. And therefore, the clergy that I was ordained with, many of whom fell out of ministry for one reason or another, I think were not falling out of ministry because of the egotistical exercise of supreme power. They were falling out because they got themselves into trouble because they didn't realize the power they had, because we had no positive discourse about power. It was just a negative thing that lot over there had and wielded against us. And it seems to me part of what church is and part of what Pentecost is all about is recognizing just how much power we can exercise. I quoted that line of Margaret Mead, never underestimate the power of a small group of people to change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. That's a bit of a cliche, but it's still worth saying. It's about the astonishing thing that happens, and Heartedge is about this as much as about anything. And we had that in the wonderful presentations this afternoon, that astonishing moment when a group of people think, we can do this. We can do this. Look at what we've done. And that's such an exciting thing to be part of. I don't think anyone ever gets tired of being part of something like that.
And all the conversation about energy and finding out where the energy is power, isn't it? So just being more aware of the empowerment that we do have. Yeah,
we associate the powerless with people going on marches and protesting and shaking their fists and so on. People who go on marches have discovered a level of power. They think it's worth protesting. People who are really powerless are people who are, rendered inactive by feeling there's nothing they can do and therefore it's not worth trying.
That's what we need to avoid in the church, which is why you should all join Heartedge.
Yeah, that's why the phrase "the future bigger than the past" is one of our phrases, because it helps people gain inspiration from the fact that they are on the right side of history, as it were. It may not feel great at the moment, but they are heading. You know, the phrase that I like to use a lot is, it doesn't really matter where you're coming from, it's about where you're going. And so if we're going to the right place, we can find great companions, which is what we've done today.
No, I think that's really helpful. It's quite easy in the church to end up as in the Numbers reading from Sunday, as kind of sitting there moaning about what they're doing to us and what we're missing and so on. And actually recognising that we can do something about it and just join in and crack on and do something now is hugely empowering. I love the phrase you used earlier about just getting on with the kingdom work and hoping the church catches up. I find that quite empowering.
Well, and in that, I think Numbers 11, doesn't it? What Moses has to realise is that if he's doing it all himself, he's entitled to a strop from time to time, but he's not using all the gifts that God is sending him. Yeah. And a day like today, everyone by coming today has made a statement that I haven't got everything that's needed to bring the kingdom, but if I get together with everybody else, they will have. And so it's a statement of faith, you coming today. I hope you felt you've been honoured by what you've shared.
Brilliant. I think we've got to the end of our time. Andy, are you going to come and finish us off, or as it were?
Finish us off. Yeah, that's right.
That's an invitation I don't get very often. Shall we thank them?